Berlin, December 31st, 1935. Spartacus Olsson reporting from the German capital. The final months of 1935 have been a journey through renewed international crisis and paralysis by the institutions meant to navigate humanity out of such troubled waters. For Hitler and the Nazis, it provided yet another opportunity to pull wool over the eyes of the world and the German people, who are increasingly supportive of the dictator, despite having to feed his grandiose plans with the already scarce food off their tables. Tonight, we look back at a quarter when ordinary Germans faced the coming of a freezing winter with growing food shortages, forced to sacrifice for Hitler's accelerating war machine. In October 1935, Italy invaded Abyssinia, plunging the League of Nations into a paralyzing crisis and exposing the fragility of international alliances. As Britain and France scrambled to manage Mussolini, Hitler played the crisis to his advantage. The overarching events in Germany during the fourth quarter was the regime's quiet but relentless consolidation of its racist and militaristic foundations. The Nazi regime laid bare to see the reality of the new German economy. Military might shall unequivocally take precedence over consumer comfort. And so, the final quarter of 1935 for the average German was characterized by food shortages and privation. The regime had now grappled with the deep consequences of its massive rearmament drive for over a year. But as summer turned to fall, Economics Minister Hjalmar Schacht's strict control of foreign exchange to prioritize military imports over civilian goods collided hard with Minister of Agriculture Walter Daré's policies to promote production and import of enough animal fodder and alimentary fats. The result was a cost of living and food supply crisis. Meanwhile, the bureaucratic implementation of the anti-Semitic Nuremberg Laws continued. On November 14th, the regime issued the First Supplementary Decree for the Reich Citizenship Law. This decree finally answered the question of who exactly the state considers a Jew, defining them not by religious belief, but by ancestry. Anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was classified as a Jew, as were Mischlinge, people of mixed Jewish ancestry, with 2 Jewish grandparents if they practiced Judaism or were married to a Jew, and certain offspring of mixed marriages or extramarital relations. This cold, legalistic definition triggered the dismissal of the last remaining Jewish civil servants by the end of this year. The November supplementary decrees to the Nuremberg Laws cemented the biological and legal segregation of Jews from the rest of the population. Stripped of their citizenship and classified merely as subjects of the state, German Jews are now drastically more vulnerable to state power. The supposed crime of race defilement, Rassenschande, went from being pursued through spontaneous acts of public humiliation to systematic judicial prosecution by the courts, the regular police, and the Gestapo. The courts handed down severe penitentiary sentences to men involved in interracial relations, while women were legally exempt from court prosecution under the strict letter of the law. Then there are reported cases when the Gestapo, feeling that the laws and courts were not aggressive enough, sent both Jewish and non-Jewish male and female suspects directly to concentration camps for their alleged transgressions. Thus, the legal order has been decisively subordinated to race and ideology. Like a constant droning under the buzz of this oppression and all the privations, Joseph Goebbels' Nazi press pumped out endless articles to manage the public's perception of the domestic food shortages, the Jewish question, and the international crisis in Abyssinia. Newspapers were strictly forbidden from discussing the scarcity of fats and meats in terms of economic failure, and instead framed them as malicious rumors spread by complainers and gripers. Foreign policy reporting was carefully calibrated to avoid a breach with Britain and France, while opportunistically edging towards Mussolini. Meanwhile, the press continued its relentless anti-Semitic campaigns. Newspapers published the names of individuals accused of race defilement and glorified the new racial laws as measures that supposedly brought peace to Germany. But The suffering of the tiny minority the Nazis blamed for Germany's ills was in any case not the main issue of the German working and middle classes. Getting enough food on the family table was their main concern. By October, Germans faced what they are calling a severe fat gap, Fettlücke, as Germany depends on imports of alimentary fats to cover demand, but foreign currency is regimented and directed to the arms industry. Moreover, there was not enough animal fodder, also an import good, so that meat, butter, and eggs became scarce and expensive. The government was forced to release 3 million Reichsmark in unforeseen emergency foreign exchange funds to give importers access to currency to procure additional butter abroad. But that did not close the fat gap, and in a desperate attempt to stave off even worse shortages, in December another 12.4 million Reichsmark were released to the exchanges, tagged for food producers to buy foreign currency to import oilseeds. Despite these measures, the crisis remains as the year ends. In lieu of a sustainable solution, the regime has shifted to agitprop to manage the public's frustration and indirect taxation to feed the hungry. As the crisis deepened, they stepped up the promotion of the fundraising campaign for the winter relief, Winterhilfswerk. Goebbels' propaganda ministry now framed consumer sacrifice, in other words, foregoing the pleasure of eating well on a proper healthy diet, as a patriotic duty. Citizens were heavily pressured into donating to street collectors and participating in Stew Sunday, Eintopfsonntag, an initiative launched in 1933 where the Nazi regime calls upon the entire German population to forego their traditional Sunday roast at least once a month. Instead of a large meal, families are instructed to eat a cheap, simple stew, often just a soup made from the week's leftovers, and donate the money they so save to the state-sponsored Winter Relief Fund. On Sundays, when these Spartan meals are consumed in German homes, mobile kitchens on streets and in squares also serve simple stews as a public showing of shared frugality. All the while, collectors go door to door to gather the mandatory donations. The simple stew has now been branded as the meal of sacrifice for the Reich. Posters advertising the drive depict happy families eating stew around a table beneath a giant hovering pot, sending the message that their private dinner is no longer merely for personal happiness, but serves a higher national purpose. Practically, the campaign is designed to conserve vital food resources, especially meat, during these times of tight controls, selective restrictions, and visible shortages. Economically, it's a hidden tax. It's estimated that this winter the campaigns will collect close to 370 million Reichsmark into the Winterhilfe coffers. Ideologically, it forces the population into a shared, visible action that is supposed to foster a tangible sense of the national community, Volksgemeinschaft. The crass reality is that the supposed voluntarism of the campaign is a lie, as it relies on intense social pressure. During the Stew Sundays, there are now even reports of SA-men roaming housing blocks and sniffing the air to check that no one is roasting and harassing anyone who is found to do so. Hitler himself has publicly mocked individuals who cited stomach problems as an excuse to avoid the meals, denouncing anyone who shirked the Eintopfsonntag as a pest lacking in character. Furthermore, while the regime claimed the collected funds were destined for charity to help the poor, observers have noted that essentially it's a tax that by substitution disappears directly into the regime's war chest. The food shortages and price inflation had knock-on effects for the entire consumer economy. Real wages for workers remained stagnant and were effectively eroded by the rising cost of living and mandatory deductions for party organizations like the Winter Relief Fund. While unemployment continued to fall to the arms industry and public works, the standard of living for the average worker noticeably declined in the quarter. Sacrifices that must be made for the sake of the so desperately desired national resurgence that Hitler and his cronies will deliver by providing guns before butter. The NSDAP leadership observed the economy and the events on the world stage with calculated but cautious optimism, while carefully managing domestic frustrations. Although their war readiness plans would have preferred rising international crisis to come later, the Abyssinia conflict has provided them with a perfect smokescreen and validated their aggressive foreign policy ambitions. After meeting with Hitler, most of the Nazi ministers, and a large part of the military leadership on October 19th, Goebbels reflected about how Hitler has understood the foreign policy climate in detail and aims to use to Germany's advantage Mussolini's precarious situation as international pressure to cease aggression in Abyssinia mounts. Hitler is purposefully hinting at neutrality so that he can look like the broker of a solution and increase Germany's standing abroad. Our sources also revealed that the Nazis estimate to only be ready for aggressive international action by 1938, and that there is some disappointment that Mussolini is now preempting them, or as Goebbels reportedly put it. The opportunity presented by the Abyssinian crisis comes to us 3 years too early, but the Führer knows the situation very clearly, knows exactly what he wants. For the rest, arm and get ready. While the party leadership seemed to be united in their foreign policy views, there are murmurs of tensions about the implementation of the new racial laws. It is said that the most radical elements within the party remain impatient, pushing for harsher treatment and fewer exemptions. Nevertheless, the leadership is reported to have felt satisfied that the November Supplementary Decrees have successfully institutionalized the persecution, finally replacing chaotic street violence with a highly effective bureaucratic mechanism of exclusion. The German public in the final quarter of 1935 either ignored, accepted, or supported the regime's overarching racist nationalist goals. Moreover, the widespread elation over the national resurgence and affirmation of German racial superiority seemed to dwarf any worries over economic hardship and food shortages. There was, for sure, widespread grumbling on the German street, yet this rarely translated into political opposition by the people who often willingly rationalized the hardships. Like Inga Thiele, our young, enthusiastic Nazi gardener apprentice who noted the food crisis in October but immediately excused the regime. It is worse with butter and fat and meat. There is a lot of murmuring about it, but our government will know why it is doing that. Conversely, the deep despair from the victims of Nazi oppression grew. Now unemployed Jewish professor Viktor Klemperer captured the agony on October 19th. We shall not live to see the end of this tyranny. The populace is enthusiastically devoted to Hitler. Luisa Solmitz, our housewife in Hamburg, caught between her Nazi sympathies and her husband's Jewish ancestry, went through stages of dejection this quarter. On October 18th, while awaiting the detailed implementing rules of the Nuremberg Laws, she told us that they lived with a sword hanging over them. 9 days later, she recorded her daughter Gisela, now considered of mixed race, saying, "I am afraid every day." Then, in early November, she told us that Gisela no longer wanted to go to school and looked terribly wretched and ill. On November 15th, when the directives were announced, she clung to one possible opening to maintain some social inclusion, noting that the Führer can allow exceptions, while her husband Fredi wrote directly to Hitler for relief. Then, on December 18th, she complained that her family has nothing in common with Jews, even as their social isolation by Germans considered non-Jewish grew. Underground Social Democrat resistance reports confirmed that the working class complained bitterly about stagnant wages and the cost of living, but claimed that the population was largely intimidated into passivity by the Gestapo and impressed by Hitler's foreign policy maneuvering. In reality, it looks more like much of the German people has chosen to run with the Nazis, either by conviction or after having been taken in by the Nazi illusionists. It's especially visible in this final transition from random street terror to straight-administered persecution. A particularly insidious move, as it pacified the conservative middle classes who abhor public disorder but are willing to accept legal segregation. An acceptance that also touched their economic reality, when the public's grumbling over butter and meat shortages never crystallized into genuine resistance. The pervasive terror of the Gestapo, combined with the psychological compensation of national pride, ensured compliance. For those of us standing outside the nationalist illusion field, the quarter revealed the inherent contradictions of Hitler's rearmament program. The foreign exchange crisis and resulting food shortages demonstrated that the German economy, could not simultaneously sustain massive military expansion and high civilian living standards. And so, by enforcing the guns before butter policy, the regime signaled its ultimate intent: prepare the nation for war at any cost. Paving way for that war, the Abyssinian crisis provided Hitler with invaluable maneuvering room. The disunity of the League of Nations and the distraction of the Western powers validated his belief in their weakness. And so, at the end of 1935, the structural pillars of the Third Reich, racial apartheid, totalitarian police control, and war-oriented economy have been firmly entrenched. Many Germans support the regime. Many others accommodate, rationalize, or keep their heads down. There is also persistent grumbling and criticism, but it often remains fragmented, private, or politically ineffective. Significantly, to this reporter, it seems that the German supporters and fellow travelers to Nazism have now been delivered what they have wished for since they lost the Great War in 1918. An illusion of absolute law and order, license to blame life's difficulties on a minority alleged to be the internal enemies, and permission to aggressively celebrate their false sense of superiority that flatters pride while dulling conscience. The Nazi fantasy has anesthetized them and made sacrifice, exclusion, and cruelty appear meaningful. While many of their neighbors merely endure the shortages, tolerate the intolerance, and keep silent, the regime's growing base seems increasingly willing to embrace intolerance as a necessary means and privation as a temporary price for a promised national rebirth. The more suffering can be explained away as discipline, and the more persecution can be dressed up as order, the deeper the country is drawn into a politics of delusion, domination, and destruction. At the end of 1935, it seems like more and more Germans are falling deeper and deeper under a spell that feeds a collective psychosis of superiority. Unless that spell is broken from outside the Nazi camp and resisted from within Germany itself, it might be too late to save the country. As it falls, it might just drag much of the world with it and tumble us all into the abyss that delusions of grandeur inevitably open. Never forget. Join me and our team to use the knowledge of history as a tool to resist falling back into the traps of the past by joining the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com.